Here we go. Okay, so I'm very happy to have Lou Lécuyer here, who is from Grenoble, and she was a postdoctoral fellow for the PowerBiodiv working group, and so she will be presenting today. And she works in biodiversity governance, participatory processes, environmental conflict transformation, and more specifically, the power dynamics in biodiversity conservation. So that means how power shapes participatory processes, decision-making, and conservation outcomes. She also works on participatory approaches and biodiversity conflicts, designing and analyzing and facilitating actors' participation and engagement. Hi, Lou. If you
Hi.
want to, yeah, get going
I
with your
can.
presentation, we are all
Okay.
yours.
You-
Thanks very much.
Thank you. And thank you for everyone. Okay, up here. So today I will be presenting the preliminary result of our work of PowerBiodiv, which was about trying to understand power dynamic in participatory process. And so in that Cesabinar, we invite you to go back to the starting point. And so here I want to say that the project was the starting point of the project was that we know that participatory processes are now increasing in terms of how we want to build project, how we want to protect biodiversity, involve people. And so it's really trendy, and it's kind of a thing we have to do when we build project around biodiversity. And there were like an increasing recognition of the role of power of power issue in this process. So quite often in article, I would read power is important, power played a role, but without going in much further detail in the article I read. So I thought it will be really interesting to see what we can understand better around power in participatory processes for biodiversity, and not using only one view on power as a cohesive power, but a multidimensional approach, and trying to integrate scientific information with the voice and perspective of institutional actors and facilitators. So to do so, for the project, we tried to build like a big group, a transdisciplinary group, including researcher, facilitators, and institutional representative, to bring together interdisciplinary scientific expertise, but also to bring empirical knowledge and practical knowledge to the table. And we organized a project around 3 axes. So the first axis was about developing what we understand and how we speak about power together, to have like a shared language, and to develop that shared language to know how we're going to do the analysis after. So that's the multi-dimensions of power. Then the second part was about using that to address power issue in participatory processes for biodiversity. And finally, we also had an axis where we really want to reflect on how it affects us, what we learn on power, how it affects our work, our project, and how we can be more reflective about power in biodiversity, in participatory processes for biodiversity. So I'm going to use those 3 axes today to present the work we have done, and leave some time at the end for question. So before I start, I want to acknowledge every member of the group, of the participant of the group. So here you can see the full list, with James and Juliet being the coordinator of the project. And then you can see we were like a wide range of people from different countries and from different practices. So facilitators, person from NGOs and researchers. So I'm going to start with talking about how we frame the multiple dimension of power in the project. So this was really the base of our work, and it was based on scientific literature, but also practitioner knowledge. We really want to emphasize that this was really a balance between both. And after, I'm going to talk about systematic review, which are central to CESAB work. But first, here it was not a systematic review, but a literature review of the theoretical framework that have been done on power. So what I've done here is that I both choose what have been said in power in other discipline, and looked at authors that have really shaped the way power is seen in and discussed in literature, such as Foucault, Bourdieu, or Lux, for example. And I also looked at what has already been done theoretically around power in environmental governance. So here that was like the literature review we did. And with the group, we had forth and back on trying to see, okay, which one makes sense, what one we can use, what one like, yeah, what we want to see we do with all those theory. And we kind of moved away to create a whole new framework, you know, actually not do a like an additional one, and decided to use an existing one and adapt it a bit, adapt it to what we know and to biodiversity, participatory processes for biodiversity. And like I say, we tested it on different case studies. So in the paper we published, for example, we tested it on, we use 6 different case studies to illustrate the different dimension of the framework. And so those were the case study we use from England, France, French Alps, from forest management to species management like the wolf. And I can go back to some of the illustration if you want later, but I won't dig into detail in all the case study because of the time constraint we have. And so now what I want to do is actually to present the framework we decided using. The framework was mainly based on the work of Gaventa and Jazz, which is a QR code here that can lead you to their work on power. And I won't go into much detail about the framework because I already presented it at a FRB event in a MIDI-conf, so I'm not going to go back on it, but I don't want to spend too much time on it. I can spend more time than today, but and what we did is like, first we recognize that power is everywhere in individual, group, and nature. It shapes our daily life and interaction, and we consider power as fluid, dynamic, and not inherently good or bad. So what we look at is like that what most people are familiar with is power over. So we will concern like look at power over, which is the ability to limit or constrain someone else's choice. And we decided also that we need to consider transformative power to understand change. So the capacity to act, to imagine alternatives, to mobilize, and to shift existing structure. So quite often those two power can be seen as power over is good and transformative power is bad. And this is where we adapt a bit of framework, saying that they are not opposite. They are not good versus bad. They are not held by two separate groups. In practice, they coexist, they interact constantly, and the same actor or organization can draw on both at the same time. If I give the example of protecting some area, like deciding that this area is protected, for some, it will be looked at transformative power because it like according to their values, this is a transformation we need in our system, in our daily life. For others, they might see it as power over because it will like stop them for using the resources they used to before. And so what we say after is that those power over and transformative power can arrive in different arenas of power. So arenas help us understand how power is operating. It can operate at visible way in the form of authority to make decision. Around biodiversity, it will be, for example, again, deciding the boundary of a protected area. But it can also operate in a more hidden way, where hidden power here refers to the informal alliances or backstage negotiations that influence that outcome. So when certain actors coordinate outside the process to shape decision or land use or compensation. Finally, we also looked at how power can operate in an invisible way. So about norms and values that shape what is seen as legitimate. So for example, we know that we assume that certain species have more values than others in conservation debate, and that is related to invisible power. In fact, finally, we looked as well at systemic power, which referred to the broader institutional and historical structure that underpie conservation. Here, one example would be how Western vision of nature and wilderness still shapes the dominant model that we applied in biodiversity conservation and in participatory processes, knowing leading to whose worldview are included or excluded. Another part of the framework was about expression of power. And here's the exercise of power. It's about how power is enacted, practiced, and cultivated. So here we had 4 dimensions. We had power 2, which was simply people's ability to act. So in participatory process, for example, we know some participants have more influence than others because of their position or experience. We also had power with, which is what happened when people work collectively. And again, in participatory process, we can see how sometimes people join forces and develop shared solution during the workshop. We have power within, which is referred to people inner confidence, which is like we, for example, quite often discuss the facilitator posture in participatory process, how it really helps the group feel supported and able to engage. And finally, we had power 4 is when the group built a shared purpose. In one example we have, in the participatory processes, they create a common narrative about livestock guarding dog and coexistence with wolf, for example. So that will be one example. Finally, we have the space of power and level of power that appear in our framework. And this is to go back on how power over or transformative power can happen in closed space. Closed space is decisions that are taken like behind closed door. And in participatory process, many things happen behind closed doors. So for example, we decide who's gonna be invited, we design how the process is gonna take place, the day and everything without or quite often consulting others. So that will be like, what happened in closed space. Invited space is when we invite people in, and in our case, it's quite often a formal workshop. So who you invite to come in. And claim space are space that community create for themselves. Applied to participatory process, one example in our case where it was in Thailand, for example, in participatory process conducted in Thailand by one of our members, women came in larger numbers and invited. And that could be considered claim space because in an inviting space, it decided to take more power by coming in with larger number of larger number of women. And finally, if we discuss level of power, so like level can go from local to global, and quite often those level of power are intertwined in the participatory processes. So participatory processes can happen at local level, for example, but they're always strongly influenced by national rule on species protection. And that lead me to show you the full picture of the framework and share with you, this is a published work. So we already published that framework and reflection we had on the different case study. And I'm not used to talk like 45 minutes in a row without questions. So I hope for all of you it's clear, and I'll be happy to go back to any question you have. And maybe one invitation I can have for you is try to think about some point, some moment where you feel powerful or powerless, and see if you could see of anything of that applying. Well, like were there any hidden powers that make you feel like powerless, or any power with that make you feel powerful, for example, and trying to see like in your cases if those different dimensions applied. What I'm moving to something else. We also use that theoretical literature review to build the codebook for systematic review. And here we had at first the ambition to use existing data set that was made by the AGE project, which was a huge, like a big project on environmental governance, a systematic review as well, but like with more resources than we had in terms of number of people and money and everything. And Jens Newig was part of our group. So we looked at their database and realized we could not use it directly for our project because it was not directly on participatory process for biodiversity. But we did use their codebook. We screened through their whole codebook, looking at which variables they use that talked about power, and we use that in our codebook. And then we also add in this codebook some other variables that come from scientific and gray literature we review, and we thought that were important when talking about power. And we also add variable relied to expert knowledge we had in the group. So we review our codebook, and some expert were like, okay, but this is not appearing here, and it's important, and it does have an effect on power issue in participatory processes. So that was really the first part of the project I want to come back on, that was more related to theoretical background. And just for a code book, you can have access to it through this QR code, and it's organized in two paths, let's say. One, so it's organized around the steps The variables are organized around the steps that is taken during a participatory process. You have the variable linked to general information and context, process design, process implementation, output, outcome, and environmental impact. But each of these variables, then we question, are they related to visible power, to hidden power, to power with? And we also like kind of double linked it to the dimension of power we had in our framework. So in total, we had 126 variable and additional qualitative data because I cut and paste some part of the article I read. I'll come back to that later. And it was an ambitious code book, a lot of variable, but why we decided to keep it that large is like I think at the end one objective as well is that code book can be used as a blueprint for people wanting to talk about power in participatory process and to show what can be looked at. Let's say like if you want to be really a full list of every variable that might have an influence on power in your participatory process, you can use that codebook as a blueprint of what you want to look at and what is important. So that led me to the second part of our project, which was about applying that theoretical knowledge to try to address power issue in participatory process for biodiversity. So here I moved to the systematic review then, and our systematic review was led by one large research question, which was, do power sensitive stakeholder participation processes in biodiversity conservation lead to improved conservation outcome? And quickly here, I'm going to I'm showing you the search string that we use. So we were a bit strategic in our search string to not have too many results, but something manageable by the team and the resource we have. So it was organized around three core concepts: participation, power, and biodiversity. And for example, we decided that the term power had to appear explicitly in the article. Of course, many papers discuss power without using the word, but we needed a clear and consistent selection criteria. So this search screen gave us around 7,000 articles to screen at the title abstract level. From there, we review around 600 full text, and that led us to 82 case studies. So the screening work was done collaboratively thanks to two early career colleagues. So we were like three doing that and using the Cadima platform, which worked really well. And after that stage, I review alone all the 82 case study myself, and apply the entire codebook to each of them, which was a lot of work, but that's fine. It's fine. I'm happy with where we at now with all those data. And so I wanted to share that this part of the project is still ongoing. We're still moving forward to using all this data. But from those data, we want to produce 4 final outputs. And let me introduce each of them briefly. So the first one will be a systematic map, which gives us a visual view of where the evidence actually is. So across stages of participatory process and across the different dimensions of power. Here we hope to make visible the clusters, the gaps, and guide eventually future research and practices. The second output is the statistical analysis of those data, and so using the variable and latent construct to see how power operates in participatory processes. So here the goal is to identify the key factors that shape power dynamic and how they affect social and biodiversity outcome. The third output would be a qualitative synthesis. And this is where we want to analyze the text extracted from the article. So like I say, I did cut and paste some part of the text that talked about power to understand how author actually talked about power, which dimensions they focus on, how they frame it, and what tensions appears. And finally, the fourth output is a citation network analysis, where we look at the literature that this article rely on. This I won't go further on it today because we haven't really started to look at it. So, but what we've done is every time they talked about power and they cited works that worked on power, we cut and paste the citation, and then we want to see what appear in that network. So these 4 outputs together will hopefully give us a rich picture of how power is addressed in the literature. And I will show you preliminary results for the 3 first one. So for a systematic map, we want to see the landscape of evidence for power and participation. And one main result that we had and that we looked at was power is often addressed only superficially in the literature. So I give the example at the beginning that people sometimes speak about power in participatory processes and just say power is important. So when we dive in empirical example and articles that use empirical example, we find the same thing. So about 11% of the case mention power only once without any supporting literature on power. So almost as an anecdote. Then 16% mention it at several places, but again, without any reference to the scientific literature on power. On 30% of the cases, power is mentioned several times and supported by few citations, but still not the main focus. In 22% power is one of the key aspects and lies with clear scientific grounding. And finally, in another 22%, power is the main subject of investigation. Out of our research string and the 82 case studies, that's what we find out. But I want just to show that even among those that detailed study, looking really in detail at power, only a very small number actually connect power to environmental outcome. So that was 18 case study. Out of those 18 case study, 4 describe the environmental impact, 4 explicitly say there is no impact, and 10 did not describe environmental impact at all. So that shows some of the limitation we faced. However, let's say even if they didn't look at power as a main object of study, because we use a large number of variables that are connected to power, but not necessarily directly looked at as power. So for example, we looked at trust. That's one example, because it does have an effect on power issue in participatory processes. But people did not necessarily put it under the umbrella of power study. So so that gives us a bit more flexibility. And so I want to show you the number of variables coded for each case study. Here we see that there were not situations where some cases look very deeply at power and while others ignore it completely. It was more in the middle. In fact, every case examined at least a set of power-related variables, with most cases covering around 60 to 70% of the variable we had. So it shows that we have coverage, but it's uneven and incomplete, which also explains some of the limitation of the analysis. And finally, here just a graph looking at data availability per variable. So for each variable, how many cases actually provided information. So we had some that have almost complete coverage, like 90 and 100% of the cases give information on that, but they are quite basic variable if you look at in more detail. So the name of the author, the year of publication, the location of the participatory process, things that are always reported. But when we look at the more substantive variable, the picture kind of changed. And here you can see that for many variable, we had only 5 to 10%, 10 to 20%, 20 percent of information per case study, per variable. So we had a lot of missing data, and that led us to only keep variable with no more than 50% of missing data, which was around 80 usable variable. Sorry, okay, you didn't see those two. I talked about it without showing it. Sorry, here it is. So here is about the number of variable per case, and here is about the number of missing data per variable. And what we want to look at in the systematic map then is how like I say, where we have data and where we don't have data according to the stage of the process of the participatory processes and the dimension of power. And this is a attempt figure. We're not going to use this one at the end because it's too hard to read. So we are looking for other way to visualize that. But in that figure, how it works is like on the left, you have the stage of the participatory processes. On the right, the dimension of power. And each line here is one variable. So you'll have one variable that is about general information and linked to visible power, for example, or one line in the context that is one variable linked to the context and that is linked to power invisible, and the color will tell you how much data we have on it. It's normally an interactive figure. So if I open it on a web page, I can go through over each line and it will give me which variable it is. But here, for the sake of the presentation, I'm not moving to the web page, but I will show you some trend we can see. So for example, when it comes to the context, we had like here a big chunk of variables that, because they're in yellow, we know they have a lot of data on it and not many missing data. And if you follow that line, it quite often go to power level or visible power. And so it's about countries, for example, where it happened, competent authority, those kind of information are quite often related. But if we stay in the context, you know, like part of the participatory process, we see here a big chunk of dark blue line. And here we can see that this goes to invisible power. And this is where there is a lot of missing data. So for example, we know little about whether participatory approaches are culturally embedded, whether there is a strong green culture, whether the issue attract public attention, for example, or whether it was seen as urgent. This is rarely reported, even so they strongly shape power dynamic. We have the same issue in the process implementation phase. Very little information, for example, on who is absent in the participatory process, what facilitation approach was used, or how decisions were made. So for example, most papers simply say there was a facilitator without describing the posture or method of the facilitator. And finally, where we had a bit more data, for example, in terms of the outcome and output and social outcome, we can see that that was a bit more covered around dimension linked to power with, such as conflict resolution, social learning, social capital. So this was mentioned more frequently, but again, not systematically. So that gives us a good sense of where the literature can be strong and where important blind spots remain. So moving now to the statistical analysis of all the data collected and trying to understand pattern and pathways of power in participatory processes. So here we use two different steps. So like I say, we only use data with sufficient, well, where there's not too much missing data. And from those variables, we use dimensionally. The first step was dimensionality reduction using factor analysis. So many of them were overlapped or correlated, and we need to identify the underlying pattern. So that factor analysis helps us uncover latent variable. And I will present our latent variable on the next slide, and allowed us to reduce a bit the complexity of the data set while keeping the meaningful structure. And the second step was to model the impact of different predictors. For that, we use a random forest model, which are well suited for mixed data, nonlinear relationship, and missing value. They help us identify which factors are most important in predicting outcome. And with those two steps, that kind of gives us a clearer picture of how power operates across participatory processes. And here I want to thank Bruno Locatelli, which is part of the group, because I'm less a quantitative scientist, so he helped me a lot to build and to go through those data. And they are really preliminary results. We got them just a few weeks ago. So here I wanted to show the latent variable we use, trying to understand the impact of those participatory processes. So we use we use different latent variable related, and the first latent variable, I don't want to go into too much detail about it because I won't have the time, but the first one was about ownership. That capture cases where participants themselves can define the problem and design the process. It reflects on how much control they have over the agenda. The second one was about inclusiveness, which is about proactively involving different type of stakeholder and creating condition for them to be able to express their voice. So the third one was facilitation, both in the design of the process and running the meeting. Then we had plurality, which was about the diversity of vision and type of knowledge brought into the process. And finally, we had unity, which captured trust, but also absence of conflict and cooperative behavior. In addition to this power-related factor, we use more structural variable, which were like the level at which the process takes place, the duration, and the size of the group, to see which one was more important to explain the impact. And for the impact, we use three variables. The environmental impact, which is in the data set, is approached cautiously. So like I say, we almost never had information on actual impact. So what we used was whether the environmental goals were achievable and whether any environmental output were reported. And then we had the social impact, such as conflict resolution, acceptance of decisions, social learning, etc., and institutional impact, like the creation of new institution or change in competency and responsibility. And here are the preliminary results. What we see is that ownership is the best predictor of impact of both environmental, well, in all cases, it appears as a important factors. And plurality, inclusiveness, and facilitation comes second. We also see that unity almost don't have an effect on impact, which is interesting because quite often we put a lot of emphasis on trust and conflict. And here we see that at the end, let's say if we have a process that have good ownership, good facilitation, good inclusivity, it doesn't really matter that level of trust or conflict to have an impact. And among process characteristics, we can see that level matters a lot for institutional impact, duration matter a little, and size doesn't. So meaning like if it's a small participatory processes or a big one with 200 participants, it doesn't have a different more effect on impact. Just to give you a bit more nuance, looked at those results. What we see is that when ownership increase, even from low level, we see better social impact, and high ownership is especially important for institutional impact. We can see that inclusiveness improves social outcome. And interestingly here, we see that environmental impact appear achievable when both inclusiveness is high or when it's low. And here we can maybe think that those processes that don't have inclusivity, but that force result and force conservation can still have environmental impact. Here, for plurality, the pattern suggests that a medium level of plurality leads to the best outcome. And when a certain level of diversity of this vision is reached, adding even more doesn't increase the impact further. It's simply level off. So plurality is important, but its effects stabilize once a threshold is reached. And we can see the same for facilitation and duration. It reaches a plateau. Excellent facilitation give results similar to good facilitation, and very long process don't necessarily perform better than medium length process, which is interesting because quite often we talked about like we need longer time like for participatory processes. So really short one, don't lead to impact, but really long one don't necessarily also lead to better impact than medium one. And finally, level is essential for institutional impact. Process operating at the national level tend to generate more change than those conducted at local level. That's some feedback we hear quite often of participatory processes about the capacity of local processes to really changing at higher level can be really limited. So this is for the statistical analysis of our work, and I'm going to move to the third output, and I'm going to try to go a bit faster because I still have things to say about our reflection work. So in that qualitative synthesis, like I say, what I did is to like cut and paste some part of the text because I felt like capturing the nuance only by quantitative variable might not be enough, and because many papers talked about things that we perceive as power in our framework of power, but that they didn't use the word power to describe it. So I cut and paste a part and put them under visible power if I thought it talked about visible power, hidden power if I thought it talked about hidden power, power with, etc. And then did a thematic analysis of what themes emerge when they talked about those different dimensions of power. And here you see the full list of themes that emerge, and the number in bracket are the number of cases talking about those themes out of the 82 case study. So I'm not going to go in detail on all of them because there are too many. But for example, on those that were very strongly represented, you can see that under visible power, institutional and regulatory constraint came up repeatedly. Under hidden power, for example, agenda control and narrative framing appear very often. So those are thematics that people talked about. For PowerWiz, you can see that collaborative learning, decision-making platform are really common theme as well. But they were like sub-themes that were much less represented in the literature. So for systemic power, seems like structurally embedded vision of nature, of historical legacy and colonization, only appear few times. So this gives us a picture a bit of how power is actually talked about in the literature, in the empirical literature on participatory process for biodiversity, the angle author choose, the blind spots they have, and the tension that emerge between different interpretations. So moving on to the last axis of work we wanted to have in our group. So we were a transdisciplinary group, so that lead to different, expectation of what we want to do, and we many of the group roles want also to focus on practices and practical outcome. So we use during our work a lot of reflective practice. We started by looking back at past projects we had each work on to understand how power had shaped those processes. And then we move a bit toward future project, asking ourselves how we could become better at noticing power dynamic in the moment while they are happening, and how we might act on them more consciously. So within the group, we created the space to test facilitation method. So each frame workshop we had, we tested facilitation method, and yeah, I think the CESAB will remember us for weird exercise we did in the room, and trying to use reflective tool. So for the facilitators, that was an opportunity to try out technique, show how they work, and see how we as a group react to them. Knowing that this method were also helping us thinking about power in a very concrete way. For example, we had the chance at the end to reflect on the journey of the project of PowerBiodiv, doing a full day of facilitated creative writing. So that was really all of that experience was really good in strengthening our ability to engage with power in our own practice. And one outcome that I was hoping it will be finished for today, but it's not, but it's almost finished. So it's really soon, I think we're going to be able to share it with you, is that we created a tool that we call Tool for Thought, which the idea behind is to help practitioners, facilitators, researchers become more reflective about power in their own project. So we present a framework, but we put key question you can ask yourself for each dimension of power. It includes audio story, where members of the group explain how different dimensions of power shape their case study, what strategy they use, and what they might have done differently. And there is a final question on how to go further, how to deepen your reflective practice around power in participatory process. So it should be released really soon and shared by the FRB and Cesab. So I hope you'll take a look and feel free to share it with others. In additional thing I can share, we made a report of each workshop where we talked about the exercise and facilitated exercise we did. We have one version that is for only the group, but we have shareable version of the report of the workshop we had. So I'm happy also to provide access to that if some of you are interested. And I'm going to go quickly to still have 15 minutes for question trying to have 15 minutes for question for the lesson learned, because the Cesabinar is also about our lesson learned. So our major strength was really to be a transdisciplinary group, I think, that led to a diversity of knowledge in the room, scientific, practical, experiential. It brought real world insight, and it also really keep us constantly focused, because practitioner will do that, on impact and usefulness of our work, which was, I think, a really good thing. But it was also a major challenge because the expectation of researcher, practitioner, institutional actor were really different. So each workshop, we had to carefully balance scientific work with the practical need of the group, especially because actually practitioners, for example, could contribute on their own time, and without being paid. So I have to take into account their their expectation in the designing activities. And also, I just want to say that institutional actors were difficult to engage consistently because this is not paid work. It was hard for them to justify to take weeks off to come to the workshop. So we had few, and I'm really thankful to the few we had, but we had some that couldn't keep being involved in the whole project. And to function well as a group, I just want to share that we had to work long time on a common theory of change. We also built clear guidelines on how we want to work together. And we had detailed reporting of the workshop to keep everyone aligned. Again, like I said before, I can share some of those with you. And if there is one key message here is that transdisciplinarity does not just happen by putting people in the same room. You have to design from the start, even when your group is facilitators and people you think are used to participation, and you have to invest in facilitation. So even here, we had a room full of facilitators. We had each session really facilitated only by one person, for example, and that helped to support the group and to make the most of its diversity. And practical advice for future CESAB group. What I would say is that for group working on social science oriented proposal, which are growing in the CESAB, but like rarer, let's say, like lots of them work on ecological data set. I really recommend reaching out to previous CESAB team. So the Just Conservation group really helped me frame the project at first, shaping the proposal, define a realistic scope, and understand what is feasible within the CESAB format. One other proposition we talked about with Juliette is that maybe if I have to do it again, I will build expertise pair. So we have the right to have a 15 people group, but I would maybe put 25 people, 25 name in the group with kind of like knowledge dyad, and involves 2 people for each area of expertise you need, which could help maintain continuity across workshop. So when someone cannot attend, you expect the other one of the dyad trying to attend, and they have to keep each other updated on what's happening. And I think that might be something useful. And third is to be careful with ambition, because systematic review in social science are heavy, and data gaps means that not all questions can be answered, no matter how hard you work. So it's important to keep the scope manageable, but I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one giving that advice. And finally, make full use of CESAB flexibility. The CESAB support have been really amazing for our group. We did, like I say, a creative workshop. We did an off-site workshop in Italy that was like really lead to another level of closeness in the group. We use graphic facilitation, and we use the graphic designer for our handbook. So they were incredibly helpful for our group, always open and supportive when we propose something new. And I think we did propose a lot of new things. So yeah, really don't hesitate to take advantage of the space they offer. And just gonna, I normally finish with a citation of Martin Luther King on power and love, but now that we did that creative writing, I'd rather finish on one text some participant write about the project. So in that exercise, we had to use that rhythm of say, I remember, starting the sentence by that, and also with the invitation to say what changed in me at the end, and what changed in me, and I think that's a quite beautiful text someone shared. It's not mine. I don't feel like reading it, but I'm happy for you to have a look and read it if you want. And yeah, almost 15 minutes for question. We can go a bit over 11 if some of you have more questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Lou. That was impressive. And thanks for sharing this little text at the end. I hope it's going to be inspiring for the audience. So yeah, definitely. I mean, we're flexible with time for questions, so don't worry. But thank you for finishing on time. And so if there are some questions, feel free to raise your hands using the tool in the Zoom, and I will distribute who gets to talk, but try to respect the order. And if you're unable to talk, you can also just write your question in the chat, and we'll pay attention and read it out loud for you if you need to. Any questions?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, go for it. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be happy to break the ice. Thank you very much, Lou. I mean, it's a great talk you gave to us, and I really enjoyed the time we had to interact with you during those years. I mean, it has changed the way I think we should follow the groups and behave, collectively in how we build the science. But so you've been addressing that point in your conclusion, but I'd like you to develop a little bit, is that institutions, and particularly scientific institutions, are really reproduce what you call systemic power. I mean, this is how we have been, formatted. And so what should we do to redesign our process and not to fall in that trap? And particularly based on your experience with the FRB and the CESAB, do you have some advices on what we should change to include all the dimensions of power into our ecosystem?
Good first question, thanks. No challenge here. Honestly, on CESAB and FRB, I actually think they were quite really like supportive to do things differently already. I mean, maybe one thing was like to dare to ask, and we did dare to ask. So that could be something, some advice sometimes is like, actually, we think we can only do things one way, but maybe it's about, like asking the question and trying to do things differently anyway. And sometimes it worked. And I feel like in our group with the CESAB support, it worked. But yeah, in more general terms, like other setting I've seen on science and other scientific projects, that was not happening. So if we want to do more transdisciplinary group, there is again really that they expect something else from the work we do, that the way we perceive things, science, we want to understand, okay, nuance and complexity and things like that, and that's fine. But also facilitators were quite happy to come out of the work we did with strong messages to send to for example, people that give them contract, that pay for what they do. So for example, facilitation here is shown to have an impact, like to lead to better impact. And I know that's a message that they're going to be happy to be able to live with. And but it's also important to show it's not like facilitation will not cover every ground, and that actually what might be even stronger in reaching better participatory process is ownership. And that will be a key message for institutional actor, maybe to carry around, like, because quite often the institutional actor we had, they do work with participatory processes, but they're quite alone in the preliminary phase of the process to design it, to to shape the question that's going to be answered, and so this lot have still happen in closed doors. Look, like if you use the framework, and lots of things still happen in a hidden way a bit, because as scientific, we worked on subject we liked, for example, and how open we are to move towards subjects that are maybe not our first interest, to more answer like what people want and what people expect, so that would be something. So yeah, like I would say there is a strong move to be done here. And really one particularity of that project on power and working on biodiversity, what changed from other, because lots of that been done on power in development, in like poverty related studies. But what I find really useful here is that we try to work on the value of nature and non-human. And there is really, really little written on that in the literature about, like, that binarity about human and non-human, and how we can change, we perceive nature and being embedded in nature. And that is coming out now, like more and more. And this is also a lot about changing the way we do things, because it's about using embodied practice to really feel what it means to be, like in different perception of nature. I think it's so embedded that we see nature as separate as human, is that if you really want to experience it in different way, you can read about it. But if you try, like create in that day of creative writing, we try to use the voice of nature instead of our voice, and that's really different than only reading about it. I'm not sure I'm answering the question right, but that's what popped into my head. What?
Thank you very much.
Yep, thanks very much. So Azenor has a question. Azenor, go for it. We can't hear you. And Lou, maybe if you want to share your screen so that we can maybe see each other a little bit more convivially. Yeah, awesome. Thanks.
Thank you.
Go for it,
presentation. Hi. It was really interesting. And I had a question about the duration of the participatory process. You said like too short or too long was not the best. And do you have an idea of what would be a good duration? Is it in terms of a total amount of time or number of meetings, or because I guess that sometimes we don't have a lot of time, so it's good to know what's efficient.
So it's more than it reaches a plateau, because long participatory processes have also good impact, but like there is a plateau that you cannot reach to a certain time. So because I think what we face today is that a lot of people want to do participatory processes, but they're not ready to give much time on it. So like facilitators, they know that quite well today. What they face is like, oh, we want to be participatory and we can give you 2 days. Or like, and 2 days is quite often long participatory process, consider long participatory process to take decision in common, like by people that pay for it and, engage for it. So I think here it's a balance about time together and time between. I don't think with the data we're going to be able to give the best recipe. Like you should have every 3 workshop of 2 days every 6 months, and that give you the best impact. But it's really about having a balance of having time in the workshop and having time between so people to have the idea and the process can get to a mature stage also where people are able to really work together and go forward and work together and have impact. So I think, that's what I can say about time.
Thanks.
Thanks for the question. Does anybody else have a question? I have questions. So yeah, I'm always impressed by the scope of your study, and I think that because I'm not an expert at all in that kind of field, but just like for me, studying power dynamics would be like such a vast question that I think that you've done it really well. And I also find it really interesting that you have this reflective practices also within the Cesab group. And I would be afraid if I had to do that, to how do you prevent yourself from always starting over, so if you examine what you've done, you're obviously going to find some flaws, right? Because this is the purpose of your work. And then you identify them, so you want to kind of do it again or something. And so it's basically going to be something that is never ending, right? How do you just decide on the cutoff point?
You mean when we say, okay, we were good enough in addressing power here? Is that
or do you just decide that this is the situation that you worked in and the results are going to be biased in that way, and identifying the biases are enough? Okay. Or do you want to rerun it, to try to do it better?
The way I understand it is how do we once we know how power affect participatory process, how we kind of take on responsibility in it, and also admit that we are not going to have a perfect power sensitive participatory process related to biodiversity, or that it's going to be really, really difficult. Well, we talked about it, the facilitators, for example, we talked about the facilitator stance. And that was quite interesting because we have different stance in the facilitators in the group. So some that say that if you give the condition good enough for the dialogue to happen with with the people here having their voice, for them it was a way to cover power sufficiently, and they've seen it happen in a really positive way and creating good outcomes. So here again, it's not about what is good and what is bad in terms of stance and posture. It's about when is it useful to have one, or when is it useful to have another one. And I think we had other facilitators that instead take a stronger posture around discrimination and power. And for example, we'll try to be strategic in inviting some people instead of other, or giving more voice to certain people than other. And in the stance, we have those that do it openly and they shared with people that pay them. That's how we're going to do it, and see if they're okay or not. People, refusing that kind of power shift. And some of them that also will do it behind closed door and strategically. And that's, even something like another stance. So we looked at that a little bit, and there is a lot of missing data because there is no studies that really go into deep into how facilitators, kind of what stance they actually take. But that would be, for me, those kind of variables that show you, okay, this is how people try to address power. And again, without saying this is good or bad, I think different situation will require different strategies. but yeah, like to know where do we put, like the threshold of this is good enough. I think it really depends on the people and on your values and everything. I don't know if he was like answering the question, but that's
Yeah. It's just a general, I don't know. I find that I would have a hard time defining that, so I asked. I have another really weird question, but if somebody else has a question before, then I would leave them to it. Leave them ask them first. Okay, I'm gonna count to 3. I'm just kidding. I have a question about AI because at some point during your presentation, when you were talking about the statistical analysis and how you applied, I don't know, was it the code book or the variable? You did it with like, you did the work on all the 82 studies kind of manually, and that must have been a kind of a daunting task. So at some point, I was asking myself, first part of the question, whether you could maybe use some AI tools to do part of the job. Second part, weird part of the question is like, how would you, if you did use AI during this process, what part of power would AI be in? Like where would you place AI? What type of power would that be? Is that like a hidden power, or is it like on the contrary completely open because everybody can see what it's doing, and it's completely objective, or is it not? Like, okay, that's my question.
So yeah, AI was not as trendy when we did it, or I would have questioned myself, how can I use it to make it simpler? Especially because my partner worked on that, so I would be like, oh, help me to make this easier. But I don't think that would have been an easy task because there is like what we did is like to think about a framework where people don't use those words exactly like in papers. They don't talk about visible power, they don't talk about hidden power, but they talked about how people shape the agenda behind the door. And so I interpret it as hidden power. So there were some variables that could have been like dealt with AI. I think the number of participants, or maybe like when they say what type of participant in the paper, that maybe could have been dealt with AI. So some of them could have been dealt with AI, but that like you need to really trust it. And especially my problem with AI is that it will always give you an answer, right or wrong. And I think that what would have make it really difficult. I would have said, okay, what type of participant happened in this participatory process and like in this paper, and he would have given me an answer, and I feel like I would have needed to check it again just in case, because maybe so farmer in the paper, and it would be like, oh, farmer were participant, and actually they were not mentioned like that. So that's something. And in terms of how, when we use AI, where it is placed in terms of power, for me it's quite systemic power, like embedded in AI, because it's so built on knowledge we already have, thing we already know, way we already think, that there is nothing really transformative on AI thinking, or I haven't found yet how. I mean, it's I find it a useful tool to structure, to reduce takes, to like write better English or things like that, but to really think differently, not yet.
I don't know.
Or
I think
not to
kind of
use it.
objectively, but like obviously there are always biases. I don't know. It was just a general question. Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else want to ask something to Lou? Or other members of the PowerBiodiv group who are here? Hi, Juliette. Hi, Bruno. All right. Well, I think then we can call it a session. Thank you so much for accepting to play the game of presenting your work. It was really interesting, and looking forward to what you guys have to say for the conference, and looking forward to the tool being ready for sharing.
Yeah, me too. Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you. Bye.